Welcome to our Sound for Video session. Today is the 10th of December 2017. Question and answer session today. Let's get into it. Here we first have a question from George. If I use a Tentacle Sync device with my MixPre-3, is it writing true timecode into the metadata of the file, or is it audio timecode? George, the good news is it's actually metadata timecode, so it's not taking up an audio track. It is using the 3.5 millimeter input, so you can't put anything else in there at the same time. Yes, it does. It records it to metadata, not to an audio track. Second question, also, any chance you could do a video on booking techniques? Well, let me say this. There are a few things I can say about that from my own experience, and this is just how I've done my, semi-pro audio location sound mixer work. I think the main thing I've done is I've established relationships with a lot of the guys that consider themselves directors of photography here locally, and directors, and usually they're the same person that do both, because these are relatively small jobs. I think probably the biggest one I've worked on was one that had a budget of probably $20,000 or $30,000. I don't even know exactly what the budget was, but based on the amount of crew there, the number of actors, the fact that they're, catered lunch, so on and so forth, I'm guessing the budget was probably about $20,000 to $30,000. So those are kind of, just to give you an idea of the area where I'm working. So yeah, it's establishing relationships with those guys, getting tied in with the filmmaking community as much as possible. And that's just a matter of meeting people and being friendly to them and offering to help them and things of that nature. So for example, I can tell you, earlier this year, I had a chance where my friend Jacob Fenn, he was working on a production for a TV show, and they were shooting with, they're shooting with a ton of cameras. It's sort of it's kind of a reality TV type of thing, and they were shooting with a ton of cameras, and we're having, post was becoming a real challenge in terms of syncing all the cameras up. So they wanted to look at time code. So he said, "Hey, Curtis, could you come out and let's just, we met up, and I gave him a little timecode demo just so they could see how it worked." And in that process, I met the guy who was the director of photography for that show. And then within like 3 weeks, he called me up and said, "Hey, I've got a commercial job. Can you come out and do sound for a couple of days?" So we did that. So that's just a good example of how I've seen it work. There are other things too. I remember my friend Scott Vanderbilt. He lives in the Los Angeles area. There's some film schools there. He went and I think essentially, and Scott, you'll have to describe exactly how this went, but I think at some point you introduced yourself and said, "Hey, if there are any students doing projects, I am available for hire." And it sounds like, I think, Scott, you were doing somewhat of a discounted rate for a student film jobs and so on and so forth. So there are lots of different ways you can go about that, but it's really, to a large extent, meeting people. There is also a website called Mandy Crew. I would not try and get those jobs until you have a pretty firm footing, like you feel pretty comfortable showing up to a job. You have the equipment you need. You know how to handle most of the situations. So those tend to be, I think, not always, but I think some of those can be larger budget jobs. And I think you really want to get your chops together before you head that direction. So, George, I hope that was helpful for you. Thanks for the questions. Next up from William, would you be able to give a tutorial on 5.1 surround sound and Premiere? William, I'm very sorry, I can't. I will say this, though. If I were doing a 5.1 surround mix, I would be over in Adobe Audition or Pro Tools or something like that. In my case, Adobe Audition. I think doing 5.1 surround mixing in a nonlinear editor is going to be pretty challenging, because nonlinear editors are really built around editing video and not so much around mixing. And so could you do it there? I'm not even sure if there's a 5.1 surround mixer. There probably is, would be my guess. But if I were going to if you're going to be serious about that, I think you'd want to be over an Audition. That's one thought. At some point, when I get a surround setup, I'll probably start doing that, and we'll probably talk about that at that point. But for the time being, I'm still just doing stereo mixing for all of my work. And I think that's about all I have to share. I apologize, William, I don't have more on that, but we'll get there at some point. Thanks for the question. All right, next up, Greg. I've started trying to use 2 booms for dialogue coverage with multiple actors. Works really well, no more missed cues. The issue now is in post, I have 2 tracks of dialogue that overlap. Each mic still picks up unattended dialogue from the other speaker. I've been telling editors that they will have to duck the tracks as the speaker changes to avoid induced reverb. However, I wonder if I'm forcing work onto the editor that I should be doing. When you work in post with multiple booms, do you try to isolate the tracks to contain just the one actor's voice so the editor doesn't have to make any adjustments? Or do you use some tool that will automatically adjust the gains based on the speaking actor? Well, good question, Greg. There are a variety of ways to go about that, and it depends, I think, partly on what type of piece you're working on. If you're working on a production where they don't really have, if they have to turn around pretty quickly, they're probably not really likely to want to do a full-blown mix where you actually cut the parts out of the tracks where that particular actor is not talking, and instead you have room tone on another track that's sort of filling in the gaps. Then you totally and completely eliminate that kind of reverb and the pickup of both mics picking up the opposite actor, or anyway, you know what I'm talking about. So that's one way, of course, to do it. The traditional way of doing it, probably the cleanest way of doing it. However, there is a plugin for doing Dugan auto mixing in post as well, which is something that you could also recommend if they want to do that. And Dugan Auto Mixer plugin is made by Waves. It's not cheap. I think it's $600 last time I checked. Let's see here. But what this does essentially is exactly what you say. It automatically finds the open mic where the majority of the audio is coming in. It leaves and it essentially fades back all of the other mics. So you get a nice clean final piece there. So that's another option for them as well. I would say this, if I don't know if the editors are complaining to you about that, but in the world where, the production values are high enough that's pretty normal to either use an auto mixing type of plugin or to have a sound post person that's, cutting out the parts where the person's not talking and filling it with room tone. So again, hopefully that's helpful for you and that kind of clarifies things. Good luck on that, Greg. Next up from Vadim. Vadim actually asked a question, I think, last time about recording podcasts. He says, I'm still figuring out the best way to record and produce podcasts with multiple hosts sitting in the same room. Could you please go through my production routine and suggest what could be improved? Usually I have 3 mono, 16, 44, 16-bit 44.1 sampling rate, tracks recorded using 3 separate dynamic microphones connected to a single recorder. That's all good. They all contain strong signal from the main voice pointed at the microphone and some bleeding sounds from voices 0.5 meter to 1 meter away. Typical as well. My typical workflow these days. Number 1, open tracks in Izotope editor. Correct the phase, remove possible noise, normalize to -2 dB full scale. Okay, so you're using a peak normalization there. Okay, that's probably fine. Well, that's okay as a kind of a setup, but you're going to have to do some mixing after that most likely. Open in Logic Pro 10, each voice on its own track. Run strip silence on each track to remove bleeding. There's another recommendation for you, Greg, for the previous question. You can strip the silence, and that's what this looks like here. I assume this is room tone down here to fill in the gaps so that when you have those cuts, and this would be the more typical way of doing things. So you have, person 1, person 2, person 3 set up. So that all looks good. Edit podcast, cut the bad parts, add jingles, etc. Make sure the tracks are loud enough. Okay, I assume at this point you're doing some mixing. So you're either fading the people that talked louder, or perhaps boosting the people that weren't talking quite as loud, depending on all things. Then to keep the bar bouncing around -19 LUFS on the loudness meter, I adjust gain of individual track parts, as hosts tend to change loudness of their voice during the show or even in duration of a phrase. Yep, that's great, especially if you're using automation. That totally makes sense. Add RX noise filters, DS, add compression to each track, and then export to WAV and MP3. Okay, yes, good questions here, Vadim. And then you showed what it looks like in Final Cut Pro. That's great. Okay, going back up. So here are a couple of thoughts on this. Normally the way that you would do this is any of this stuff right here. Well, let's see. Loudness is usually the very last thing that you do. The very last thing. So I think what you'd want to do is move all of this to the very end right before you export to WAV or MP3. That means you would move your noise filtering, de-essing, and compression up above that. Also, the compression is helpful to give you enough headroom to meet this loudness target. So that's really the main thing that I can say about your workflow. That's the main change I would make. Everything else seems pretty good to me. I hope you're happy with the results, but everything else looks pretty solid. So keep up the good work, Vadim. All right, next up, I purchased new sets of Tentacle Sync E. I used it in 3 different events so far and loving it. I use them on the MixPre-3, Canon C100mkII, and Canon C100mkII. The question is, when I use Tentacle Sync E with the C100mkII, I'm not getting any camera audio in my video footage. I plug into the mic jack on the side of the C100. As soon as I plug in, then camera audio is gone. I've called Canon and talked to their tech support and tried to figure out this problem. I have stayed late and contacted Tentacle support tech in Germany, and they haven't given me any solution. I need to have camera audio when I'm recording a video for ambiance sound, such as clapping or things like that. Or scratch sound is I think what you're talking about there. I have 4 tentacles and I've tried them all, so it's nothing wrong with the devices. And camera, mic, and audio is working fine as well. And I'm using tentacle cables. Please help. Okay. Well, first of all, I've never sent timecode to a C100mkII. So the first thing, I have a question of just doing a quick search online. It does not. I know it does not have a dedicated timecode input on the C100mkII. What I don't know is whether or not it has a 3.5 millimeter audio microphone input. It doesn't look like it did based on my research. If someone else knows better than me on that, let me know. So I assume what you're doing is you have a 3.5 millimeter to XLR cable from the Tentacle Sync that's going into the Canon C100. That being the case, to get audio, so the way it works is, and there are some other things you could potentially do with the C100 as well. But when the audio is coming, what you get out of the Tentacle Sync E is on the left channel you get timecode, on the right channel you get the microphone that's built into the Tentacle Sync. So whatever audio is coming into that goes to the right channel. However, if you are using a cable that's 3.5 millimeter to XLR, single XLR in this case is a mono cable. So it's only going to take the left channel and the right channel will just disappear. You'll not have it. So that is my guess as to what's happening here. So the one potential solution is to perhaps go with a cable like this. There's a 3.5 millimeter TRS that would be plugged into your Tentacle Sync, and then you get a left and right XLR, and you'd plug both of those into the camera, and then you should get timecode on one track, audio on the other, and that's audio from the Tentacle Sync microphone. So that's one possibility there. Just a warning, in most cases, what I'm finding is that the audio that you're getting from a Tentacle Sync or another device like it that has a microphone, you're going to get some timecode bleed potentially. In often cases, I think in most cases, you will get some bleed. So it's really important to understand that that's just going to be scratch audio. So it's fine to pick up slates and claps and things of that nature, but it's probably not good enough to use for ambiance because, again, you'll get some of that timecode bleeding into that track. It's kind of the reality of using an unbalanced cable, which is what we're talking about here. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is I don't know how this works on the C100. I know that on my Ursa Mini Pro, for example, I can actually have an external microphone plugged in to one channel, and I can record that, say, for example, to the left channel, and then I can have the camera's mic go to the right channel. That routing is possible to set up in the menus. I don't know if the C100 does something like that, but that's another possibility. In that case, if you could assign the the built-in mic on the camera to go to the right channel and then send the timecode to the left channel from the Tentacle, that's a possible solution as well. You may get better audio that way, maybe, I don't know. And I don't know if the Canon is capable of doing that type of routing of the audio. But those are a couple of thoughts that I hope will help you get to where you need to go. So thanks for the question there. All right, next up, Stephen. If I may ask, I'm an amateur filmmaker working on some passion projects. I love producing film and sound as a hobby, but I'd like to start earning some extra money in the field, perhaps by producing some corporate videos. Do you have any advice you can offer me on how to make the leap from amateur to semi-pro? I certainly do. So in my case, I'm a freelance location sound mixer that I do, a handful of jobs a year. Probably this year I've done 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 8. I've done about 8 so far this year. But then my full-time job, I kind of do 2 things. Half of me is a corporate video shooter, so I do everything, both the camera and sound and all the post. And then the other half of the time, I'm a product manager for my company. So that's how I got into that, was that I had my job first as a product manager. I had a reputation already because I was already very interested in photography and filmmaking. When we got closer to the business has a customer conference once a year, I offered to help out with some of the video work that we had to put together before those. And so over time, I just kind of became the video guy. So that's how I worked into it in that case. As far as the freelance work, I think I discussed that before. Really, it's a matter of getting tied into the filmmaking community in your local area. And you can do that by joining Facebook groups on filmmaking for your area. Almost every major metro area has something like that. Even not the cities that aren't that huge have that too as well. So any sort of local user groups, or not user groups, local filmmaker groups, something to join there, consider. You have to be willing to meet people that are directors and DPs, and producers and things of that nature. So you just want to find those people and get to know them and offer to help them and let them know that you do sound, or in this case, if you want to do the whole thing, you want to do video and sound. So that's kind of the main thing. It's mostly just relationships that's my experience doing it. Now, I haven't been selling my services out to do corporate video for other clients. Generally, I've done just a couple here and there. But again, in those cases, for me, it's been, a friend of a friend type thing. So that's the main advice I can give you there. Other people I've heard people do crazy things like, just listing online that they're available to do these types of jobs. So there are lots of options out there. I hope that helps a little bit, Stephen. I don't know if my case is typical. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. If anyone else has some ideas, love to hear them down in the comments below. All right. Next up, JB, got a quick question about the Zoom F8. I'm shooting a documentary which will be shown primarily on the web. I've got a two-person, two-camera interview with a camera on a reporter and a camera on a subject. I've got 2 microphones on each person, 1 small diaphragm condenser on a boom as the main mic, and lav as a backup. I'm shooting in a large living room, a little bigger than your basement with 10-foot ceilings. The room isn't too reverberant, and I have sound blankets if it is. So here are the questions. Number 1, how should I set up to record SD cards 1 and 2? Well, JB, that depends on what you're hoping to accomplish and how much work you're planning to do in post. So he says down here at the bottom here, there are no clients for this, just me. Well, there is a client, but they will take what I give them. I just want to learn the right way to do this. So there's not necessarily a right way, but what I will say is that if I were doing the post, what I would hope to do is I would hope to record isolated tracks so that I could do the mixing in post. If you're operating camera and sound, you're going to have a bear of a time trying to do an actual mix while you're recording and operate camera at the same time. So what I would probably do is I would record polywave. And if you wanted a stereo mix as well, you can do this LR, left-right polywave, which will give you a left and right stereo mix plus the individual isolated microphone tracks. So actually, you know what? That's actually not, come to think of it, that's not that helpful, because if you've got a lav and a boom on each person, you're not going to want that in a stereo mix. You're going to want to choose which mic in post. So really probably just polywave. And the next question is okay, do you, for what you should record to sound this SD card 1 and 2, if you're just really looking for redundancy and backup, then I would record polywave to both of them. If for some reason you need some other special thing, for some reason you need an MP3 or you need, I don't know, sometimes whatever the case may be. In the case where I would be doing this, I would shoot the same thing to both cards. Polywave is what I would do. Short version. Okay. I'm inputting all 4 mics into the Zoom. How should I output to the cameras, or should I just record scratch audio and use the Zoom recordings in post? Well, typically what I do, and again, I can't tell you what you need to do in this case because it's really up to you on how you want to do the post work. But in my case, I wouldn't even bother with output to the cameras. Again, if I'm doing everything else, I don't typically bother with that. I will slate at the start or have the talent clap, and I'll do the syncing in post and won't bother getting the sound to the cameras. If you need to do a quick turnaround, that's where outputting sound at the cameras might be a good idea. And then we have a previous sound for video session where we talked about how to set that up, and there are some things you want to do there to get that set up. Number 3, are 4 mics overkill? No, I don't think so. That's how I typically do it. I typically have a lav and a boom, and we then choose in post which one we want to use. Almost always it's the boom, if I can do both. If I don't have the option and I have to do wireless, then we do wireless, and I monitor it very carefully to make sure that we get what we need so that in post we have something we can work with. So I don't think it's overkill. With regards to the audio tracks, what's your workflow in Audition for a 2-camera setup? You're right, this is a long answer. But what I would typically do is, depending on how long the piece is, workflows can differ pretty dramatically. For very short pieces, if I already know which camera take I'm going to get or use, I will only process the audio for those, and I'll actually process the audio up front, get those over to edit, sync them up for the edit, and then do the edit. And then I don't have to do a post, the audio doesn't have to come after the original piece. So that's one idea. That's how I do most of my YouTube videos. However, if you wanted to do a more traditional workflow, you would just go ahead and sync the entire audio up to the video tracks, do the edit. Then you would send out an OMF to bring that over into Audition or whatever video editing digital audio workstation you're using. And then you would decide at that point which tracks to keep and which to get rid of, or which channels to keep and which to get rid of. So there are lots of different ways you want to do it. So it's a long answer, but that's how I would do it. And I would do that the same for 2 cameras, 3 cameras, whatever it is. Okay. I think that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, you're kind of setting yourself up here for I think a good workflow, but it's not a very quick turnaround workflow. It's something that's going to take a little bit of time. And again, it depends on how much effort you want to put into really fine-tuning the sound and getting it just right. Number 5, does it matter if I shoot mono or stereo for my B-roll? Honestly, for B-roll, I just shoot camera audio, and because usually for B-roll, I'm not using that audio. If you are going to use that audio, and you are going to be capturing some ambiances, then maybe you might like stereo. That might be nice. But yeah, that's up to you. I think for B-roll, I assume you're not capturing dialogue because usually that's not the case. B-roll is usually not dialogue, so by definition. So in any case, hopefully that answers your questions. So, all right, JB, those are a good set of questions and definitely shows you're making some good headway, so keep that up. Next up from Dwayne, I seem to be having a problem with powering my MixPre-3 with an external battery. I purchased the Anker PowerCore 26800 as you suggested, and I also purchased a USB 3 to USB-C cable by Tentacle, or however that's said. And after connecting them all, it does not appear to be powering the MixPre-3. Your feedback and or recommendation would be greatly appreciated. Let me grab something here. I think, and I actually already have been corresponding with Dwayne on this, but just for everyone else's benefit, I actually bought this particular Anker USB battery pack, power bank, and I'll put a link for it in the show notes, but this one actually has a USB-C output. That's what you need. Here's the thing. The USB specification prior to USB-C, or 3.1, and it's getting more and more confusing. USB It's getting confusing. So the short version is that when you're using these Type A connectors, the specification for those is the max voltage that they can supply is 5 volts. And I believe typically the amperage goes up to 2.1 amps. And so you can do the calculation to figure out how many watts that is. However, the MixPre requires more power than that. So you have two choices. With the cable that's included, you can use both USB-A ports and then plug the USB-C in on the other side, or you can get a single USB-C to USB-C cable. Now again, I don't know if your that PowerCore power bank that you bought has USB-C, but if it does, a USB-C to USB-C cable will solve the problem for you. Or potentially, if the power bank can supply enough wattage, using that cable that came with the MixPre-3 with the two USB-A on one side and the USB-C on the other side may or may not do the job. Again, it depends on that particular power bank. So I know it's confusing. That's the thing. I think that Sound Devices did something. It was a really good choice that they made to enable the MixPre to be powered by USB, but I think they knew also it was a risky choice because USB-C is complicated, and you have to have the exact same thing. So it's not easy for them to say on their spec page or their documentation, this is exactly what you need, because it's a fairly in-depth answer. So anyway, I hope that helps, Dwayne, and best wishes with your shooting there. Next up from Marshall. Thanks for posting your order of operations for Dialogue Audio. Very helpful and good timing. For those of you that don't know what that's about, a couple of weeks ago, or was it last week? I think it was last week, actually. Our Sound for Video session focused on the order of operations when you're post-processing audio, specifically dialogue audio. Continuing on, I currently use Audition for all my sound editing. I'm often not happy with my understanding of exactly what tool to use and in what order. Though I've gotten better than I was starting out, I'm still looking for a more defined workflow to improve my sound. Based on the recommendation of others, I've been looking at Izotope for a little while now, but I'm still confused. I could use some help deciding which product or what family of products I should be using and why. Should I use RX, and if so, standard, advanced, or the entire suite? What is it that you like about Nectar that's so great? Is there other sound design software I should be considering? Okay, let me tackle those first, and we'll come back and get the rest of it. I would say this. I would say if Audition is what you have, I would learn how to do all of this in Audition. You have most of the tools that you're going to need in most circumstances in Audition. I would get a solid workflow going there first, would be my recommendation, before moving to RX. The reason I say that is not because I think that RX is too difficult for someone, but I think that it's really important to get a solid understanding of what each of the steps do and finding an order of operations workflow that works for you to get reliable results. And I would say doing that, assume that you have a relatively decent production sound file that you're working with. So if it's really, really bad, that's a different story altogether. But just sort of processing and sweetening and getting a really solid sound using Audition would be my first recommendation. So if you're confused about whether you should go with RX Standard, Advanced, or the entire suite, I would stick with Audition for now and really get to feeling comfortable with that workflow. So I hope that's not an answer that really is off-putting, but that's my recommendation. What is it about Nectar that's so great? Well, I use the compressor and the de-esser in Nectar, and the reason I do that is that when you're using RX, there is no built-in compressor. There is a built-in de-esser, but not a compressor. So there is a leveler. This could turn into a long story, but the short version is it works and it's fairly fast. I like the UI. It's really to a large extent it becomes a kind of matter of preference. So that's why I use Nectar, not because it's a good compressor and it's a good de-esser, but it's not. There are other good ones out there too. I guess that's what I should say. So I don't think it's that great. It's just it has a good UI that works well for me. It's simple enough. The de-esser has a very simple UI that works really well. The nice thing about that de-esser is it helps. It essentially finds where the sibilance is and helps you remove it, and all you're doing is setting a threshold. So it works really nicely and quickly. So that's the main reason I use it. Is there other sound design software I should be considering? I would say at this point, probably not. If you're not feeling really comfortable with your workflow and you're not necessarily feeling like you're getting consistent results yet, again, I'd stick with Audition for now and come back to RX later. However, if you do go with RX, I have RX Advanced. The reason I have Advanced is there are a few tools in the Advanced version that are not in the standard version. And from my understanding, there are actually 3 versions of RX. There's the there's kind of a RX plugin suite, which is about $100. The standard version, which I believe is $300, and then the advanced version, which is more than that. I don't remember exactly. Go to izotope.com if you want to find out the details on that. And then also RX can come bundled with a variety of different suites. So in my case, I'm using advanced. And what advanced has that standard and the plugin suite do not have, or I think they call it Izotope RX Elements. That's what it's called, excuse me. And I think that's 3 plugins. It's the denoiser and a couple of others. I don't remember the other 2, but in any case, the reason I like advanced is the advanced has the the phase rotation, adaptive phase rotation, which standard I believe does not have. I think standard actually now has the D-reverb. Let's take a look. We may as well. Okay, so we have 3 versions, RX Elements, Standard, and Advanced. Advanced has D-Russell, which is fairly new. Just came out earlier this year. Really cool. Has D-Wind, which is also pretty cool. It's not perfect, but it's good. Dialogue Isolate, which is also a pretty cool thing. So those are 3 things that Advanced has that the others do not have. It also has this ambiance match, which once you start getting into mixing can be pretty helpful. Oh, I didn't realize loudness is only in the advanced version, so that's pretty important. So EQ match can be really, really a neat thing as well. I didn't realize the leveler is only in advanced as well. So here's a page. I'll go ahead and put a link to this here that shows the differences between the different versions. Continuing on, I work mostly with a small production crew, though occasionally with a full crew, and the same amount as a one-man band. In my case, less than half my jobs have a budget for location sound recordists, and even a smaller number have funding for post-sound. That being said, post-sound often falls into my part of the edit. And then he added sent another email later. I've been thinking about this more and I'm adding some thoughts to my questions. Since I only have Audition, how do I use those tools to accomplish the same work in the order of operations? Is it even possible? If so, what tools and what starting points and other suggestions do you recommend? Marshall, I have great news for you. I have a course that covers all of that, specifically in Audition. If you head over to school.learnlightandsound.com, that we run through how to essentially process the dialogue audio using all the things I showed you in RX in the order of operations video. So hopefully that's helpful for you. It's obviously more than I can answer here because we have multiple hours worth of instruction in that course. Most of it you could piece together in previous Sound for Video sessions if you don't have the budget for the course. But if you do have the budget for the course, we'd love to have you join that. And it's a little bit more focused. It gets to the point a little bit more quicker. So a little more quickly. All right, next up, J.H. Brooks looking to upgrade from the Tascam DR60. The choices between the Zoom F4 and the Sound Devices MixPre-3 very rarely have more than 2 to 3 inputs, mostly interviews. Which would you choose? Well, you asked which I would choose. I actually have both of those, and I own both of those, so I get to make that choice from job to job. I can say this. Actually, I now have the MixPre-10T. I had the MixPre-6. Traded that in for the 10T. If I have to choose between the MixPre and the Zoom F4, it depends. If I'm doing a job from a bag, sound bag, and I'm booming, I would choose the MixPre in most cases. For me, it works really, really well. I like it. I like the features. We have videos that talk about those. I think I linked that to you in the email, so you already have that. For those of you that are not aware, I do have a video where we actually compared the Zoom F series to the MixPre 6 in my case at that time. So there are lots of considerations. Neither of them are a perfect device, or none of them are perfect devices, but I think they each have their strengths. If, on the other hand, I am going to be at a desk or a cart or a table, doing a long mixing job or even a shorter mixing job, and I want to use my control surface that I also have for the Zoom F4 and Zoom F8, I really do like the Zoom. So oftentimes in those cases, I'll take the Zoom instead of the Sound Devices for those cases. So if I could only choose one and I'm mostly doing bag jobs where I'm actually booming at the same time, I would get a MixPre. That's the very simplistic answer. There's a lot more into it, that goes into the considerations, or goes into the decision about which one is best for you. I will put a link for the video where I compare the two. All right. For those of you that were here for sound, which was most of you probably, I have a question here. This is a bonus question about lighting. You don't have to stick around, obviously. But Hans asked, how much light does the Aputure COB300d put out at 2 meters with one light dome attached, measured in aperture, shutter speed, and ISO? So this question actually does have a context. Hans is actually looking to add a light to his kit that, I'm not sure exactly what you'll be using it for, but, he's trying to figure out what the kind of practical differences are between the COB120s and the COB300 is. And the answer to that question, Hans, is that at 1/60th of a second shutter speed, ISO 200, my light meter, my Minolta handy light meter here, measured roughly f5.6. 5.6. It was just under 5.6. So that is with the light dome on and standing away at 2 meters, measuring at 2 meters. So hopefully that's helpful to you and gives you a sense for how much light you're getting out at that point. I think the COB120, if I recall, with these same settings, is usually closer to f4 or perhaps just under f4. And that's my practical experience that tells me that. So you're getting about another stop of light. I would also say this, for those of you that care about these lights, and this is Learn Light and Sound after all, I suppose. So the Aputure COB300d is not my daily light. If I'm going out on location to work on a corporate piece, I will take a 120 in most cases, unless I'm doing something kind of special or unique, where I need a lot of light. And usually in that case, I'm going to use the 300D. Farther away from talent, it's usually going to be used in a flood or perhaps with a Fresnel. So for me, the COB120D puts out plenty of light for interviews and talking head, and even sometimes other things where you can keep the light, within a couple of meters generally of your talent when you're doing the framing so that you can keep it that close. So that's my thought on that. I hope that, Hans, it helps you at some level with your decision there. So best wishes on that. Okay, that is our Sound for Video session for this week. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below, or any recommendations based on the questions here. We have people that have been contributing their thoughts on these questions, which is really helpful to get everyone else's experience. So keep that up. Get out there, make some great sound, and we'll talk to you again next week.